Welcome to our video on configuring Windows Server 2008 Active Directory. This is part 1 of creating and maintaining Active Directory objects. We're going to be discussing creating an OU structure, container objects, creating user accounts and user account attributes, account resets, disabling versus deleting user accounts, template accounts, and OU filtering. Organizational units create the logical structure of Active Directory. We had talked in a previous lesson about sites, which mirror the geographic structure of our network. Organizational units and domains are used to create a structure within Active Directory that mirrors the logical structure of the company. So, for example, whenever I think of Active Directory, I like to think of banks because every bank I've ever walked in, there's a place where there's tellers, there's a place where there's people that open accounts or deal with accounts, and then there's usually some managers floating around in the back with the safe. So I could use that to create an OU structure, maybe accounts, tellers, managers, so that I could break it up logically according to how my company is divided up. When you're designing the OU structure, as far as Microsoft is concerned, your first sort of priority should be administrative needs. So we want to use the organizational units to kind of divide up our logical resources according to how we plan to support them. So if I have a situation, let's say when I worked for AIG, we had multiple buildings in New York City, I could actually have gone through and created OUs that started with each of the buildings, building 1, building 2, so on and so forth through building 5, because there were different LAN teams for each of those buildings. And essentially what we want to do, we're going to get into the delegation of control wizard a little bit later, what we want to do is divide up the administrative pie. So in an ideal world I can go and say, okay, LAN team that's responsible for building 1, I'm going to give you ultimate control of everything inside that OU. Outside of that OU you have no rights. So you can't go into the building 2 users and make an adjustment. You can't do anything with the building 3 computers. But within building 1, that's from yours from there on down. If we can't break it up based on administrative needs or it's not clear cut, our second sort of priority is group policy needs. And we're going to spend a lot of time within this topic in different videos talking about group policy. Essentially, group policy lets us make a change to the computer based on the identity of the user that's logging on or the identity of that computer or both. So that really is our centralized administration, would be group policy. So if we can't decide based on LAN teams or how we're going to divide up the administrative responsibility for our company, then we can also base our OU structure on group policy. But if you have to make a judgment call, you first want to break it up based on administrative needs, then go on to group policy. Certainly one thing to note is that organizational units are not dependent on DNS namespace. It has absolutely no relationship to how I've done my domains or anything to do with DNS. And they're certainly not dependent on network topology. Again, that's what I'm using my sites for. That's how I'm going to geographically address my company. And even if talking about the example where there's 5 buildings in a city, it sounds like geography, but really each of those buildings could be a site. There could be multiple sites within the building. So it doesn't necessarily have to go, don't mistake that sometimes you might build OUs that seem like they're based on geography, but that's not the overriding reason that we're doing it. If we're looking to address geography, we have sites. When we're looking to address the logical structure or the administrative structure, that's where we're going to dig in and use our organizational units. So let's go ahead and make some organizational units. I'm going to go into Start and click on Active Directory Users and Computers. And Active Directory opens up. And the easiest way is just to click this button right here to make a new organizational unit. So I can do that. Now, as you're creating it, notice this checkbox, Protect Container from Accidental Deletion. That's on by default. If I leave that checked, I'm going to have to jump through some hoops to be able to delete that organizational unit, but it's going to be harder to accidentally delete it. So there's some pros and some cons. So we'll leave it checked for this. And let's go ahead and make our tellers OU. And then we had said if this was a bank, now the other way to do it is to right click here and make a new organizational unit. And this time we'll uncheck protect container from accidental deletion. Let's make this one for our managers. And then I click OK. And now I've begun to build my logical structure. Now you probably have observed already that Active Directory comes with some built-in containers and organizational units. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Before we go into the actual containers that come with Active Directory, we want to talk a little bit about container objects. And this is a very difficult term because there are containers, sort of like with a little c, a generic word containers, and then there are objects of the type container. And it's a nuance that's sometimes difficult for students to grasp, but is very, very important. So the word container really means can contain other things. And if you look, you can see that there are things inside of users, there are items inside of domain controllers. So everything in this list, there are things inside of Contoso, in a very generic form, are containers because they all can contain other things. But this Contoso.com is a container of the type domain because that's a domain. These new things that we've created, managers and tellers, are containers of the type organizational unit. And you can see they have a little bit different picture. If you compare that picture to the one, let's say, of users, they get that little, looks more like a file folder, or I'm not sure exactly what that symbol is, but you can tell that they look different. So organizational units have a little bit different pictures, and they're used for organizing Active Directories. The ones without that symbol, built-in, computers, foreign security principle, these are containers of the type container. And it's a special type. And the difference between an organizational unit and a container is that organizational units can have group policy applied to them. Containers cannot. Organizational units can be deleted or created by the administrator. Containers can't. So if I right-click here, I do not have the ability to delete this. Whereas if I come down to tellers, I have very different choices. I can delete it. So containers come with Active Directory. They can't have group policy applied to them. And they're sort of integral to Active Directory, so you want to be aware of that. So that's kind of the big difference between an organizational unit and a container. Now we're going to go through and take a look at creating user accounts and user account attributes. And we're going to be using Active Directory users and computers. You want to have especially good understanding of the Accounts tab and some of the other tabs. Some tabs are certainly more important than others, but make sure that you're very familiar with the user account settings. We're going to start by going into Active Directory users and computers. So I'm going to click on Start. You can always get there through Administrative Tools, Active Directory users and computers. The first thing we need to do is decide which OU to place the user in. And by default, of course, Active Directory comes with the users container, but we don't actually want to put the users in there because it's a container and it's not going to be subject to group policy, which is not going to allow us to really leverage the features of Active Directory. So we'll go ahead and make a sample account inside of tellers. And I can either right-click here and do a new user, or if you wanted to, you could simply click this button right here and that would make a new user as well. We're going to fill in the first name, we also need to fill in the user logon name, which you actually don't technically have to have, but you should always have that. And certainly as you're developing your Active Directory infrastructure, you want to come up with a naming convention. It should be well documented, and it should be such that if you get some certain information about the user, the help desk or the support personnel should be able to tell what their logon name is. There are pros and cons against making it something like first initial last name versus, let's say, employee number. Certainly the more obscure you make it, the harder it is to hack an account. On the other hand, also the harder it is for the users to